Next, we're going to do some quick round robin policy updates, and let me turn it over to Anna to lead us through them. Anna, floor is yours.
Great. Hi, everyone. Thanks, Joel. I have some updates that I've pulled together from Capitol Hill. And I also welcome other people to jump in because I definitely do not have a comprehensive list here. But as we definitely all know, the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act was signed into law on the 15th of November. So that was since our last meeting. And there's definitely adaptation and resilience elements to that. And ASAP, I don't put you on the spot, Rachel or Brianna, but I know that we have a kind of spreadsheet that has more information about different adaptation resilience elements of that some of the members of this group have put together. So maybe we can share that at some point during the meeting in the chat. Joel and John and others have worked to put that together, which is a super helpful resource. Of course, the Build Back Better Act has passed the House and is now in the Senate. And our understanding is that there are more tweaks coming on the environment and climate pieces of that. But I would love to hear from anyone on this call who knows what those tweaks might be. I haven't heard from our contacts what they're looking at there. And then I also wanted to highlight that the Select Committee on the Climate Crisis, which is a House committee, had its most recent hearing on or titled Tribal Voices, Tribal Wisdom, Strategies for the Climate Crisis. And I can share the link to that for everyone. That was held on November 18th. And it featured information about a recent White House summit that happened, also on the same topic of integrating tribal knowledge into federal work. And so I'm dropping a couple links in the chat here related to that, and thought this group would have interest in learning about what happened there. And oh, great. And Brianna,
spreadsheet too. I just put in for you, Anna.
Perfect. Thank you. Mm-hmm. And the last thing I wanted to highlight, sometimes try to pick out some lesser heard of legislation that's been introduced on the Hill that might be of interest to this group. So one that came up in the last month is that Norma Torres, a Democrat in California, introduced a piece of legislation that would work to fund demonstration projects to improve electric grid resilience with respect to wildfires. So that is just one other minor or, lesser heard of thing that's happened on the Hill. With that, I thought if others had updates to round out what's going on at the federal level, we can open the floor to that for a few moments. You can just jump in.
Well, I will. Roderick Scott with Flood Mitigation Industry Association. We all have tremendous amount to celebrate. Half a dozen years of hard work in DC with the Congress and 2-3 administrations now, and the banks and financing. Our biggest problem with adapting our buildings is the financing of that. And there'll never be enough taxpayer dollars for that. We estimate just for flood, it'd be 10,000 years at their current rate of adapting buildings. We don't have that. So the Storm Act became law January 1st of 2021. After Congress, the last session of Congress passed it, became law. 500 million appropriated to the brand new program in the infrastructure bill. We have another 500 million sitting in BBB. We'll see if it gets chopped or passes or whatever, but at least we have the money to start the program and get administrative rules written. The whole concept is that people who own property that is at high risk. This is a multi-hazard bill. So it started as a flood bill way back in 19 and now it's morphed to a multi-hazard bill. So it's earthquake, fire, wind, and flood retrofits on buildings, assets as the banks call them. And so there's trillions of dollars of assets sitting out there that are at risk. And the financial institutions in this country are extremely concerned about it. So we've got the money to start the program. FEMA is going to write the rules. We've asked FEMA to do a series of stakeholder meetings because last thing we want to do with a new program is have them write some rules kind of based on a grant program and then release it and say comment, and then we're going to publish it. And it's got to work really differently this time, especially with our industry and the adaptation professionals in there. And we've all got to have input that we need equity, we need forgivable loans for low-income families that live in these hazard zones that provide all that workforce for tourism, related industries, and other important parts of our financial system economy. We hope that the banks will make good on their commitment at the Treasury building 2 years ago in the spring when they told the Treasury that if a resilience revolving loan was made law, that they would loan the country several $100 billion to fix these buildings, which are going to have no value in 20 years, at least on the flood side, with the insurance rates going up. And fires, awful hard to get now for insurance, and we're paying out the nose for it. And the wind is really wicked, and earthquakes are a hidden risk that we've got to get these millions of buildings bolted and braced and adapted. So we are very excited that we are entering a whole new phase of financing this adaptation ourselves as property owners and moving forward out of the dependency on just a limited amount of grant funding. So thank you.
Thanks, Roderick. Anyone else want to jump in with brief updates?
Well, I'll just mention, this is Joel, just so I'm doing a part-time thing with the U.S. Environmental Protection Agency, and I apologize to people in the breakout group, but just to mention that as you all know, the federal agencies all issued their adaptation plans a few months ago. And I can say from EPA's perspective, they're now moving to develop implementation plans for all the program offices as well as the 10 EPA regions. And those are moving ahead. I think the schedule is to have them ready by February. But I could say I was just sitting in some internal meetings, can't talk about specifics, but just seeing draft plans being developed. And it's a lot of impressive initiatives going on at many different scales. And I hope that's going on across the government, but trust that it is. Yeah.
Thanks, Joel. If anybody else has additional updates, legislation you want to share, state or federal or local, feel free to drop it in the chat and people can engage with that. But I think I will pass it back to you, Joel, for our next thing. I think I might need to do also, but go.
Right, you're not off the hook, Anna. You're gonna hear. So anyway, okay. So now for the main event for this this monthly meeting, which is the updates from the meeting, the 26th meeting of the Conference of the Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, which wrapped up in Glasgow last month. So we're going to focus on 3 topics, although there is potential to cover more if others want to add in. We're going to first look at advancements in state-led and NGO-led adaptation, and Anna is going to be doing that. Next, we're going to look at methane and deforestation. Phoebe is going to give us an update on that. And then finally, Stuart is going to address financing and adaptation. So I think, as my understanding is, we're going to be doing this in plenary, so we'll do this in consecutive order. So I'm going to suggest everybody take no more than about 5 minutes or so. After that, we'll have breakout groups on these 3 topics, and you'll be able to go into the topic that is of most interest to you. And I'll reintroduce the topics before we go into those breakout groups. So Anna, if you want to tell us about state and NGO-led adaptation, and then why don't Phoebe jump in when Anna's done, and then Stuart after Phoebe. Thanks.
Okay, awesome. I'm actually going to try to share my screen here because I felt like there were too many different things. So one moment. Okay, did that work?
Yep, that looks great.
Great. So I wanted to share briefly about, as Joel said, adaptation initiatives around COP26 that involve not only country level work, but also non-state actor work, and also share some thoughts on how it might integrate with work that policy practice group members are doing. But before I do that, I wanted to say that I think one of the major challenges in communicating about what has happened at these international climate conferences is that there's two, and some people might argue even more than two, different kind of entire worlds happening at the same time at these meetings. And one is the actual negotiations, which are actually quite constrained in what they are able to do in any given year. And then there's also the world of like all the other commitments and activities and things going on that aren't in the formal negotiations. And so there's always expectations that are like integrated across those, but some expectations are totally reasonable, and some expectations are things that the negotiations in and of themselves really would never be able to achieve. So not to say that we shouldn't criticize the system as a whole and what could change about that to allow it to achieve more, but I think that is a challenge when we're hearing kind of the analysis of what's come out of COP. And so with that, I just want to acknowledge, I think this COP, with its faults and all, but it did finish the Paris rulebook, which was something that had evaded negotiators since Paris was adopted and ratified in 2015. And so that was a big achievement to allow the process to move more fully to implementation versus planning and rulemaking. So I think we'll start to see some major changes, and I think some of this adaptation stuff is a part of that, which is kind of exciting. So quick run through of all these different things that grew around COP26, and I think I probably used most of my time already, so I'll go really fast. Okay, so I'm just gonna outline the fact that all this stuff happened or scaled up. And we can dig into it more, or if anyone wants to talk about process stuff around COP, happy to do that in one of the breakout rooms. So this Adaptation Action Coalition is a country-led effort, and it's got the US is on its steering committee, though the US did join later than when it was initially founded. And this group's got all these different working groups with 2 countries leading each working group, and they're mostly broken out by sector. So there's one on water, and there's I think 5 or 6 of these different working groups. So that's sort of a parallel process to the UNFCCC for countries to share, I think, basically more kind of technical assistance and knowledge sharing on how to take adaptation steps in these different sectors. The Adaptation Research Alliance was formally launched at COP26, though it had sort of informally started about a year ago. And this is a group that has it's a coalition, and there's an emphasis on South-South collaboration on research, but there's also a lot of collaboration with institutions in the global north as well. And their work is really focused on action-based adaptation research. And something I found really interesting about this group is their emphasis on trying to connect funders that normally fund science and funders that normally fund action. So one example that one of their focal points shared with me is USAID is funding action, and a group or office like the National Science Foundation is funding science. How do we get them to work together so that they're funding action-based research that can really inform the decisions that are made and the projects that are happening on the ground? So that's kind of one thing that they're focusing on that relates to the US. Folks probably have heard of this Race to Resilience, which is coordinated by the high-level climate champions for the UNFCCC, and is basically a way for non-state actors globally to share adaptation actions and research. And there's also a Race to Zero campaign, which was launched far before the Race to Resilience, and it's sort of an interesting story. I heard at COP the high-level champions talk about how they started the Race to Zero, and then were told by adaptation folks around the world that they were really missing a major opportunity, and they were convinced to start this Race to Resilience. So it's sort of a tag-along effort, but it definitely had a lot of prominence at COP26, and the Race to Resilience also had sort of this resilience hub that had probably hundreds of events that happened throughout the 2 weeks of COP, working to elevate resilience in the conversations happening there. Okay, really quickly, these last two, risk-informed early action partnerships and Coalition for Climate Resilient Investment, 2 additional COP26 driven initiatives to first, on the one hand, address pre-disaster preparedness, connecting across climate, humanitarian, and development stakeholders, and then the second on the investment side of things. And then at the bottom here, I've just listed out, I think some other folks are going to talk about adaptation finance, so I'm not going to say anything on that, even though it was a massive piece of the conversation. But the last one I will mention is that in the negotiating text, the cover decision, the Glasgow Climate Pact, there was an agreement that they would establish this Glasgow Sharm el-Sheikh work program to actually figure out what this global goal on adaptation means and how they're going to measure it. Global goal on adaptation was in the Paris Agreement, but has not really had an agenda to figure out what's going on with it since the Paris Agreement was adopted. And so this is going to be a really interesting opportunity for countries to shape what that's going to look like. And it would probably be really interesting to have further conversations with this group about, if there's ways that we might engage with the US entities that are going to be deeply involved with this work program. So I will leave it at that. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Or the Canadian entities and Mexican entities, perhaps, Anna.
Sure, yeah.
Excellent report back. Wonderful. It's always really hard to follow Anna because she's on target and has multiple detailed slide summaries, and I'm sorry that I will not have that. I was not at COP26, but I had a whole team of British colleagues over there. And so I'm really just going to offer some extremely brief insights from them and from the coverage of our work there that help shape on that. So Joel, I think I'll be able to make up a little bit of time. Let me just share slides. I did not prepare for this, but I was also giving a talk about part of this stuff in the middle of the night as a plenary conference contribution to a university in South Africa. So it's the middle of the night, my time, just to really keep you on track here. Maybe I'll start, actually, instead of what's in the agenda, I'll start with this paper here, which was presented at COP26 and split up into no fewer than 6 press conferences. And in this, we took a bunch of really top-level scientists, economists, and governance specialists from around on. Could you switch off my screen, Brianna, because I keep freezing. I really don't do well with that. The 6 issues that we had proposed in 2019 as the core areas that humanity as a whole needs to deal with on climate adaptation: energy, atmospheric pollutants, nature, food systems, population stabilization, and the shift of economic goals. We took those now into a basic blueprint for global action by communities and other decision makers at levels from really local, i.e. household and community and city, up to the UN level, and laid them out in terms of what was needed at 3 timelines by 2026, 2030, and 2050. And so I'd like to highlight that this paper is a framework for what I will also say about pollutants and in specifically methane and the deforestation issues. The link is in the agenda, I believe, Brianna. Please, I would love it if everyone in ASAP who's listening to this could go and co-endorse this fairly concrete blueprint for action by decision makers around the world by co-signing it at the link that's in the agenda. We aim to have 20,000 co-signatories from every country around the world in the next year, so that would be super. But beyond that, and the and these 6 press conferences which elaborated economic and nature and governance and atmospheric pollutants issues, I wanted just to reflect that I think we've observed probably the tipping point. Whoops, sorry, that did not work well. We've observed probably the tipping point of multilateralism in our civilization. I think a lot of people walked away from COP26 feeling that although there had been concrete gains, that it really spelled out the limitations for the global public policy process in trying to change things. However, I do believe that there were clear goals also in terms of methane being highlighted and how we can not only reduce emissions from a mitigation point of view, but also extract methane and other greenhouse gases from the atmosphere, not just with what's variously and often too euphemistically called nature-based solutions, but also with increasingly the need for careful and scalable technologies to do that using ecosystem processes. And then secondly, I think that COP26 did achieve some really good attention to the need to slam the brakes on land transformation and deforestation. There's far too much euphemism and really dangerous public policy making, including in states like mine, Washington, where well-meaning young new legislators are adopting language that sounds really good, but ultimately is put forward by the timber industry. That's been called out by scientists like Beverly Law and Bill Muma, my colleagues and co-authors, in the Huffington Post, or maybe it was the Washington Post. I can try and find it and put a link in. But there were certainly gains with the number of countries that signed on to deforestation agreements. Sorry that I have not got a nice slide to summarize all of that as Anna did. I hope that broad insight is helpful for some of you. Thanks, Jill.
And if you could share your slides with me via email, I can get them out to the group because I see some people are asking questions in the chat for links. I'm not sure what happened to Phoebe, but Stuart, we'll hand it over to you.
Okay, I was kind of waiting to see whether she was signing off or what was happening. So thanks for the handoff, and really glad to be able to talk today. Hope you can hear me okay. I'm sitting in the new Penn Station in New York City. So I have a list of things that's in the agenda, and those were sort of the high-level bullets and kind of the takeaways that I wanted to cover. And I actually want to start with a kind of skeptical inspiration that I come away with. That's the way I would describe it. And part of that, both Anna and Phoebe kind of touched on, in that there were too many global South countries and locations and representatives missing. And yet there were advancements on some conversations with Indigenous communities and sort of the ocean sector and some other areas that were pretty positive. So I was in Scotland for a total of 3 weeks and at COP for the first 10 days, and felt a kind of yin and yang the entire time of my time in Glasgow. And I think for us, one major feature was that there was much more of a presence of cities and mayors, and that was profound. I could tell and I could hear that feedback with the cities that we were there with, but also from the broader network and some of the other places that we do the broader resilience work. And I listed some other things that were really sort of popped out at me over the time period. Some of this came from the fact that I also then went and took more than a week afterwards in the north of Scotland and visited with people on islands and coastal areas who were so incredibly interested and focused on what happened at COP. And so these big picture things that we talk about in these meetings were resonating with small farmers on an island in Scotland. Happens to be a relation of mine who was very versed in what was happening there, in part because the entire COP took over the north of Scotland and influenced a lot of the conversations that were going on. But I think in addition to the cities movement, there were corporate movements that were very positive, but at the same time, you saw reports about the largest delegations being at COP actually being oil and gas, not country delegations and things like that. So it felt very yin and yang, and I was looking for the positive as I listed some of these things. One thing we did specifically was to look at local or a variety of types of financing tools and funds. And so we had announcements and presentations on the community resilience finance tool and the equity scorecard, the RIDE scorecard on our resilient community impact fund, et cetera. And there were more of those things, and we're members of the Race to Resilience and some of the other things that Anna mentioned. And so I do think because of the budgets that we're going to see in our federal government in the United States, and then how they affect global conversations, I keep the inspired part going. I also feel like a lot of what we saw showed how hard others are fighting against the kind of changes that we need to make or are somewhat complacent. So it inspired me to come back and sort of double down on the things that you see there that I felt like were positive, and to figure out ways that we as a group, ASAP and beyond, Resilience 21, et cetera, can do this work together to keep pushing, at least at the domestic level, even as we're working with our global cities. So I'll stop there.
Thanks, Stuart. And Bryn, I do see that you were able to hop on the call. If you want to jump in, please feel free. We do have maybe 3 to 4 minutes before we have to go to breakouts.
I guess I could just share. We were there presenting a showcase, a project of ours that was about heat analysis to inform where bus shelters should go. And it was a fun kind of entryway into conversations, just to show an example of how equity and data can change what investments have looked like. I'm in LA, and in the past, bus shelters have been treated kind of like billboards, and they've gone in where ad revenue makes most sense. So I found people were kind of very interested in like practical examples of that, of how public investments can be done differently. So that was kind of some of my experience there. I reflect a little bit. The only other COP I participated in was back in 2009 in Copenhagen when I was living there and organizing the People's Summit. At that time, it felt like there was like one side event where stuff was happening. And so just kind of noticing how much has changed in 12 years. And now there's this proliferation of all sorts of side events happening across town, in like every space that could be used, different university rooms, every business park, just so many kind of spread out, and so many different players seeing themselves as in this space. And I think that's I also am encouraged by the media attention that was on COP this year compared to previous years. Just considering it's voluntary commitments, and so having that that spotlight to, I don't know, shame or cheerlead action is important. So I guess another highlight of mine was going to the People's Summit that was convening in the evenings every night to kind of do some public education, help people understand what the tensions were that were being negotiated there, and articulate some responses back to the negotiating teams. So if anyone gets to participate in a future COP, I'd recommend those People's Summit as a good kind of entryway to try to understand the very complex system that's kind of meant to be complex, I think, and not necessarily super inclusive. But,